Okay, so chapter 12, essentially we've covered all the stuff from before, but now we're opening up the economy. So we're allowing the introduction of exports and imports. And essentially what we're looking at here is initially the concept that we might want to export more than we import, or the opposite. So it's essentially the same kind of idea as if you and a friend had stuff that you wanted to sell and buy. So let's say I have a snowboard and you have a bike and so on and so forth. And the value of what I want to sell you is like $500. The value of what you want to sell me is like $400. Well, in that situation there, since I'm giving you more value than you're giving me, I could potentially say, well, give me those other things there that will values up to $100 so that we're even. Or the other context is that give me $100 or give me some money in exchange so that I get that money from you so that we're even. So now we have this idea that essentially we have net exports, but we also have net capital outflow that has to balance out. So if I export more than I'm importing, you owe me money, and that money that you owe me comes in the form of capital. So those two things have to balance out. And we've seen the concept of savings and investment, and how now we have to include this capital either flowing out or in, which leads to a foreign exchange market, how exchange rates are determined. So we talked about briefly just the idea of nominal exchange rates, such as the bid-ask spread, what we typically notice when we're going to the bank. But then there's also just the idea of the value of the currency, which could be observed on xe.com, and it could be represented in two different ways. We focus on the amount of foreign currency per domestic currency, so that if that number goes up, it means that the domestic currency is appreciating. But then afterwards, we started looking at the real exchange rate, which essentially we're trying to see what's the value of a certain product in one country versus another. So we want to take into account not only the nominal exchange rates, but we want to take into account the relative prices of the goods. So if I pay a certain amount of money for a beer here, with that same amount of money, how many beers can I get somewhere else? What kind of ratio am I dealing with there? That's the real exchange rate. And essentially for some goods that are traded, and we've seen that it doesn't apply to all goods, but for some goods, we get to that idea of that real exchange rate is equal to 1, or that we have that law of one price, or purchasing power parity, which essentially means that with that same dollar bill, you can buy just as much goods in either country. And that essentially flows to that idea that essentially happens because if the good is relatively cheaper in one country than the other, and there's easy trading between the two, it's easy to ship it, and there's no extra fees, while more people would buy it where it's cheaper, driving up the price. Less people would buy it where it's more expensive, driving down the price. And at the same time, you'd buy more of their currency, driving up the price of their currency. And eventually, things would balance itself out. So it's an interesting theory just to kind of see how exchange rates evolve over time due to relative prices and other things like that. The last concept that we've talked about was this idea of interest rate parity between different countries. Regarding the real interest rate. It's an interesting concept. We don't spend too much time talking about this in this class, but essentially, unless there's political differences, we're observing this idea that interest rates should equal out more or less between the countries. And this concept of interest rate parity is what's going to influence the model that's covered in chapter 13 of the small open economy. So I invite you guys to look through that, which is an extension of what's being covered in chapter 12, will be covered in a slightly different way in chapter 13.